What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Coding Cove. Quick reminder before we start, if you want notes on C or Python, check the link in the description. It's 90% off right now, but only for a limited time, so grab it while you can. Alright, let's jump into Python syntax and PEP 8 explained for beginners. Have you ever written Python code that looked completely correct, but Python still gave you an error? Why does forgetting just one colon stop your entire program from running? Why does indentation matter so much? And why do experienced Python developers care so much about something called PEP 8? In this video, we're going to answer all of those questions. You'll learn the rules that Python uses to understand your code, the most common beginner mistakes, and the official style guide that helps programmers write clean, readable Python. And by the end of this video, you'll understand one of Python's biggest ideas. Good Python code doesn't just work. It should also be easy for humans to read. So, let's start with the most basic question. What exactly is Python syntax?
So, what exactly is Python syntax? Python syntax refers to the rules that define how Python understands and runs your code. You can think of syntax as the grammar of the Python language. Just like spoken languages have rules for forming correct sentences, Python also has rules for writing correct programs. If your code follows those rules, Python knows exactly what you want it to do. But if you break those rules, Python won't understand your program. Sometimes the mistake is as small as a missing colon. Sometimes it's incorrect indentation, or even writing something in the wrong place. Learning Python syntax isn't about memorizing lots of complicated rules. It's about understanding how Python expects your code to be written. Once you understand those rules, writing Python becomes much easier. So let's begin with one of the most important syntax rules in Python. It's called indentation. The most important syntax rule in Python is indentation. Unlike programming languages such as C, Python does not use braces to define blocks of code. Instead, Python uses indentation. Indentation tells Python which lines belong together. Let's look at an example. If the value of x is greater than 5, we want Python to print a message. Notice that the print statement is indented underneath the if statement. Notice that indentation tells Python that the print statement belongs to the if block. Now watch what happens when we remove the indentation. Python no longer knows that the print statement belongs inside the if statement. Instead of running the program, Python raises an error. This is why indentation is mandatory in Python. The standard convention is to use 4 spaces for each level of indentation. Not 2 spaces, not tabs, 4 spaces. Once you get used to it, indentation makes Python code much cleaner and easier to read. Another important Python syntax rule is that Python is case sensitive. That simply means uppercase and lowercase letters are treated as different characters. Let's look at an example. Suppose we create a variable called name using a lowercase n. Then we create another variable called name using an uppercase n. Although they look very similar, Python treats them as 2 completely different variables. When we print name, Python displays one value. When we print name, Python displays another. This is why paying attention to uppercase and lowercase letters is so important when writing Python code. A single capital letter can completely change the meaning of your program. As a beginner, this is a very common source of bugs, so always double-check the spelling and capitalization of your variables. Now let's look at another important part of Python syntax: statements and comments. A statement is simply an instruction that Python can execute. For example, creating a variable is a statement. For calling the print function is also a statement. Although Python allows multiple statements on one line, that is generally not recommended. Instead, write one statement per line. It makes your code much easier to read and maintain. Another useful feature is comments. Comments are written for people, not for Python. Python ignores comments when it runs your program. You can use comments to explain your code, leave reminders, or make your programs easier for other developers to understand. As your programs become larger, writing clear comments can make your code much easier to follow. Now that we've covered Python syntax, let's talk about variables. A variable is simply a name that stores a value. For example, we can store a person's name in a variable called name. We can store their age in a variable called age. One of the things that makes Python beginner-friendly is that you don't have to declare a variable's data type. Instead, you simply assign a value. Python automatically figures out the type for you. If the value is text, Python creates a string. If it's a whole number, Python creates an integer. If it contains a decimal point, Python creates a floating point number, or simply a float. And if the value is either true or false, Python creates a Boolean. This is called dynamic typing. It allows you to focus more on solving problems and less on declaring data types. Next, let's look at the rules for naming variables. Now that you know how to create variables, let's look at how to name them correctly. Python has a few simple naming rules. Variable names can contain letters, numbers, and underscores. However, they cannot begin with a number. For example, name2 is perfectly valid, but toName is not. Remember that Python is also case sensitive, so name and name are two different variables. Another important rule is that you cannot use Python keywords as variable names. Keywords such as if, for, while, and class already have special meanings in Python. Finally, Python programmers usually follow a naming style called snake case. That simply means using lowercase letters with underscores between words. For example, student name is preferred over student name or student name. Following these conventions makes your code much easier to read, especially when working with other developers. Now that you know the basic syntax rules, let's talk about writing Python code that is clean and easy to read. This is where PEP8 comes in. PEP8 is Python's official style guide. It doesn't change how Python runs your program. Instead, it provides a set of recommendations for writing code that is consistent and readable. Think of it as a guide for writing Python the way experienced developers expect to see it. For example, two programs might produce exactly the same result, but one can be much easier to read than the other. That's the goal of PEP8, not just code that works, but code that other people, including your future self, can easily understand. Let's look at some of the most important PEP8 recommendations. PEP8 contains many recommendations, but as a beginner, there are a few important ones you should remember. First, use 4 spaces for each level of indentation. Second, leave spaces around operators such as the equals sign and the plus sign. Third, keep your lines reasonably short so your code is easier to read. Fourth, place each import statement on its own line. And finally, follow Python's naming conventions. First, use snake case for variables and functions. Use Pascal case for classes, and write constants using uppercased. These recommendations may seem small, but together they make Python code cleaner, more consistent, and much easier to maintain. Now, let's compare some code that ignores PEP8 with code that follows it. Let's compare two versions of the same program. The first version works, but it ignores several PEP8 recommendations. The function name isn't very descriptive. There are no spaces around the operators, and the indentation isn't consistent. Now look at the second version. The function has a clear name. The spacing is consistent. The indentation follows Python's conventions, and overall the code is much easier to read. Notice that both programs produce exactly the same result. The difference isn't what the code does. The difference is how easy it is for another programmer to understand it. That's exactly what PEP8 is trying to achieve, writing code that is clean, readable, and easy to maintain. Now that you know how to write Python code, the next step is learning how to run it. There are 3 common ways to execute Python programs. The first is the Python interpreter. This is an interactive environment where you can type Python code one line at a time and immediately see the result. It's perfect for experimenting with small pieces of code or testing new ideas. The second method is running a Python file. You simply save your code in a file with the .py extension and run it from the command line using python file9.py or python3 file9.py, depending on your system. The third method is using an integrated development environment, or IDE, such as Visual Studio Code. An IDE gives you useful tools like syntax highlighting, debugging, auto-completion, and an integrated terminal, making it much easier to build larger programs. No matter which method you choose, Python executes the same code behind the scenes. When you're learning Python, making mistakes is completely normal. In fact, every Python programmer has made these mistakes before. Let's look at three of the most common ones. The first mistake is forgetting to indent your code. Python uses indentation to determine which statements belong inside a block. If the indentation is missing or inconsistent, Python will raise an error. The second mistake is forgetting the colon after statements like if, for, while, or def. Without the colon, Python doesn't know where the block begins. The third mistake is mixing tabs and spaces. Python expects indentation to be consistent throughout your program. The easiest solution is to always use 4 spaces for each level of indentation. Don't worry if you make these mistakes at first. Learning to read Python's error messages is part of becoming a better programmer. Before we finish, there's one more thing every beginner should know about. Python has a set of reserved words called keywords. These words already have a special meaning in the language. That means you cannot use them as variable names, function names, or class names. For example, imagine trying to create a variable named if. Python immediately reports an error because if is already used to make decisions in your program. The same applies to words like for, while, class, return, and many others. As you continue learning Python, you'll naturally become familiar with these keywords because you'll use them every day. The important thing to remember is simple. If a word is a Python keyword, don't use it as the name of your own variables. Before we finish, let's quickly review the most important things you learned today. Python uses indentation to define code blocks, and the standard is 4 spaces for each level of indentation. Python is case-sensitive, so uppercase and lowercase letters are treated differently. Python variables don't need an explicit type declaration because Python determines the type automatically. PEP 8 is Python's official style guide for writing clean and readable code. Use meaningful variable names, proper spacing, and follow Python's naming conventions. You can run Python code using the interpreter by executing a Python file or by using an IDE such as Visual Studio Code. Avoid common beginner mistakes like forgetting colons, mixing tabs and spaces, or using incorrect indentation. And finally, remember that Python keywords are reserved words, so they cannot be used as variable names. Technical master these fundamentals, and you'll have a strong foundation for everything else you'll learn in Python.
That's it for today's video, guys. I hope you learned something new.
If you found this helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And remember, if you want notes on C or Python, the link is in the description. 90% off for a limited time only. Don't miss out.
See you in the next video.